Welcome back. We're going to take a quick look into the functioning of the central nervous system and kind of take a walk through of the components that we have there. Much of this we've looked at before in anatomy, and so we'll just kind of look at some of the pathways and some of the processes that are happening. Now that we've seen how the action potential is formed, how we generate that from graded potentials and action potentials, we can now start to look at the central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system for how it's then able to do the things that it does in a sense. So when we start out with the nervous system, it's always in a sense kind of a process of looking at what's coming into the system. And so we have sensory information that comes in, either being conscious, being our sensory stimuli here, or being unconscious information generally from visceral information. That's going to get sent over into the central nervous system. So we're going to come in through afferent fibers, send that into the brain and the spinal cord, and the brain and spinal cord then has the ability to then process our information once there. Once it figures out, in a sense, what it needs to do with that information, then we're going to send it out through efferent fibers, and those efferent fibers are then going to go out and affect some sort of change. If it's going out to things like skeletal muscle, we're going to head down the somatic motor divisions. If it's going down to things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, our glands, then we're going to head down through autonomic processes. And so we're going to head either into our sympathetics and parasympathetics, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And then we affect basically everything in the body, everything from our skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, our glands, digestion. Digestion does have, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on as well, its own, in a sense, kind of nervous system. We have the enteric nervous system. So it has its ability to function even without input from the central nervous system at all. And so direct stimuli coming from the digestive tract allows it to affect change in the organs that are there. So our central nervous system, remember, contains our brain and spinal cord, and so it has those specific structures there for the processing of information. So all of our sensory information is incoming into it. All of our motor information is outgoing from the brain and spinal cord. And in between, in a sense, the sensory and the motor. So sensory comes in, it goes to the central nervous system, and we do processing. And then from that processing, we can then come back out and do motor. And so we can then affect some sort of process outside of the central nervous system itself. That sensory information is everything from inside the body as well as outside. So things that are monitoring things like what's inside the blood, how much oxygen we have, what are our glucose levels, what's our blood pressure, things like that are all being monitored, as well as things outside of the body. And so what are we touching? What are we feeling? Are we hot? Are we cold? All of those components play a role in there as well. And then that responds to some sort of effector organ, and that effector organ then does something with that information. If we're hot, maybe we turn on a fan. If we're cold, maybe we put on a sweater, things like that. But then autonomically, we're going to have those changes occur in the body as well. We start to sweat, we start to shiver. Those kinds of changes can occur also. The spinal cord portion of our central nervous system is basically a kind of like a two-way street. And so it's our information superhighway. This is where we're going to have afferent information traveling up towards the brain, and we're going to have then efferent information coming back down. And so it's going to have ascending tracks and descending tracks. And we looked at those in anatomy, the different kinds of tracks that were there, and saw that they control different processes. It's a very organized structure as far as the spinal cord goes. And the ascending pathways themselves are going to primarily be taking information that has come in from the body and send it up to the brain here in order to process that information. And so we're going to send that information there, process it, converge it, decide what we need to do with it, and then we send it back out those motor efferents and send that information down to whatever organ system it needs to go to from that point. But there's information traveling up, there's information traveling down. So we have ascending pathways and we have descending pathways traveling within that cord itself. And this allows for us to process that information. Sometimes that information, as it comes into the cord, it goes directly back out. And so it comes in directly and goes right back out, and we have things like reflexes. Those reflexes themselves are ways that we can have an immediate response to something that is happening. And so the brain doesn't necessarily always need to know about this information, at least not right away. We want to be able to affect a change quickly enough to where we're going to have the ability to potentially save a part of the body, so to speak. And so we can alter things very quickly that's there. And so reflexes basically allow us to make it so that we bypass the brain, but we don't bypass the spinal cord. The spinal cord is still going to be involved in the process. And so here we have a deep tendon reflex that's going on here, and our little hammer comes in and hits, and that very quickly stretches our muscle. And as it does so, it pulls on that little tendon there, and our sensory information comes into the cord. That sensory information, when it comes in, when those specific receptors inside the muscle fire off, those will always immediately fire on motor neurons. And so motor neurons, our efferents, will head back out, and those motor efferents will head out to muscle. One is going to actually be a process of exciting the muscle, and one is going to be a process of inhibiting. So since we hit the patellar tendon there, that patellar tendon is connected to our quadriceps. Our quadriceps are going to want to shorten. We just quickly stretched them out. And so if we shorten them, then we can relieve the stretch that was there. So we're going to need to be able to activate our quadriceps, but then inhibit the hamstrings. And so it's going to work in two different ways. But again, we haven't sent anything up to the brain yet. That information traveling up towards the brain is still on its way. And so we've effectively bypassed it, thereby potentially protecting those quadriceps muscles. The brain itself, when it is involved in things, its ability to learn new information is incredible. And so the brain has great plasticity. And so this plasticity, or this kind of plasticiness, in a sense, this moldability of the brain, is due because of new connections, not because of new neurons. And so new neurons are not formed essentially after in terms of the adult brain, and even in the child brain, once the number of neurons is kind of set, for the most part, new neurons are not being created, simply new connections. And so we're kind of wiring new processes together. And so if we have a piece of information that's coming, it's going to essentially change who it talks to. In terms of that neuron itself. And so it's going to send out that information. And those neurons may then send out their information out to other neurons. And they're making their connections to other places. And we're making all of these new connections all the time. We're starting to put those connections together. We're hardwiring these processes. And sometimes literally this pathway becomes pretty much ingrained. It becomes hardwired in there. We don't have to think about certain things all the time. The process of essentially walking. And so we can walk without really having to think about the steps that we're taking. We don't have to think about the processes that are involved in all of those steps, because this pathway has essentially been hardened. And so that same pathway, every time we want to take a step forward, we're going to do this particular pathway. We take another step forward, we do this particular pathway, and so on. And so that plasticity that is there allows us to have great ability to learn new things without necessarily having to create new cells. So in order for the brain to do all these different functions that it has in terms of making new connections and firing off action potentials, this takes a tremendous amount of energy. And so the brain has to maintain its normal homeostatic balance relatively tightly. And so the brain's conditions that are there are maintained primarily by what we call the blood-brain barrier. And so this blood-brain barrier allows us to control what is going to come into the brain's environment and what's not going to come in. What we can get in and what we can get out is controlled by this set of barriers that are there set up by our astrocytes. And so this allows us to make sure that only, in a sense, the things that we want in and around the brain get there. Other things like potentially toxins and substances that are found in the blood, they're not able to get there. And so back in anatomy, we looked at the astrocyte. And so that astrocyte was a cell that was in great numbers within the nervous tissue itself. And one of its jobs is to surround our capillaries in and around the brain itself. And what it helps to do is maintain this barrier that's there, even more so than what the blood vessels can. So that what the capillaries are able to control there is selectively allow for only certain substances to get through those membranes. And so it's going to essentially control what can come in and what can come out. This also helps to maintain the things like electrolyte concentrations, so that we don't have huge changes. We don't have huge amounts moving in and out. One of the other big things that we need to maintain inside the brain is adequate amounts of glucose. And so we need lots of energy there. And with that, we're also going to need adequate amounts of oxygen. And so both of those are going to be able to diffuse through relatively easily and make it into the brain's space itself. Other things that might be floating around inside the blood here that we don't want, things like bloodborne toxins, things that are found inside the blood itself. They may be waste products from other cells elsewhere, different chemicals that we may come across. We don't want those to be getting across that blood-brain barrier. So we're going to limit their ability to make it through the tissue itself. In addition to maintaining what is there as far as the content, we're also getting it because the brain needs so much oxygen and glucose in order to combine those two together to give us ATP. We need to maintain blood flow and blood pressure moving to the brain. And so this remains nearly constant as it comes up to the brain, which is why when we do things sometimes like stand up too quickly, if we're not able to maintain that blood pressure and that blood flow to the brain, we start to feel a little bit dizzy. We start to feel the effects that are there from that lack of blood supply to the brain. And that was only seconds. That was only a couple of moments where we had that decreased supply. But that just goes to show how high of a metabolic rate that the brain actually has. And so we have to maintain that normal flow that is there within the brain and within the systems themselves in order to supply all of that needed ATP for our cells to do their job. So a quick little review in a sense of the functioning of the brain itself. And so we looked back in anatomy and we saw some different areas that we had there in terms of the brain. And so we have distinct regions that we can see. Within the cerebral cortex, we have essentially all of our processing, all of our higher learning information that is happening in there. We have our basal nuclei, we have our thalamus, the hypothalamus, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, all giving different functions to the brain itself, and to a certain degree, kind of moving from more basic functions to more complex functions as we move up the pathway as well, give or take a little bit as we see there. And so for that, again, kind of starting at the bottom and working our way up, the brainstem is working on the things that are essentially keeping us alive. These are the processes that are going on that we don't really have to think about most of the time. These are all mostly autonomic types of processes. Cerebellum primarily is about our balance and control there. For things, has some cognitive control, influences movement within the body itself as we're moving around. Hypothalamus is kind of our master control. This is that area of the brain where we're going to be able to regulate just about everything within the body itself. And so it has influence down on things like the brainstem. It has influence over hormone controls within the body. The thalamus is our relay station. This is for both our afferent and efferent information traveling up and down the cord. And so it plays a role in kind of sorting out and determining where things are supposed to go as they're headed up towards the cerebral cortex. I'm going to skip the basal nuclei here for a moment. The cerebral cortex allows us to control things like our sensory information, our conscious perception of sensory input, our conscious motor control, things like that, all of our language, all of our processing, everything that makes us who we are as far as our personality goes, all of that is up there in that cerebral cortex. Along with the motor control that we have from our conscious side of things, we then also have the basal nuclei. And so the basal nuclei is going to be doing things for movement that we, again, don't really have to think about so much. And so when we don't want to move, it's going to inhibit that movement for things. And so it also allows for kind of repetitive motions, things like that. Things that we're doing over and over again are partially controlled here by the basal nuclei as well. Next up, we'll start to look at how that control is formed out into the peripheral nervous system in our next video.